All right, hey guys, it's Luke back with a new podcast. I taking a break from telling you about how my exciting training is going. So this is actually a post I've been working on a while, and I've been thinking about for a while. But with the recent happenings with the marathon last couple weekends, it's been a good time to revisit some of the stuff I was looking at as far as research. But so I think you'll find some use out of this. I think this can pertain to a lot of people. So originally, why I started this post was because a person had asked in our Facebook group. They basically asked about how to avoid a late marathon fade, and we weren't necessarily talking about bonking, right? We weren't talking about losing minutes per mile over the last few miles. We were talking about losing, 10, 15 seconds a mile over the last, 3-4 miles. And so it was like a definite slowdown, but it wasn't necessarily that, hit the wall bonk. And so, the easy answer on that would be, you need to look at your nutrition. And, that's definitely part of it, but is it all of the answer? And I don't think it is. And so I want to dive into that. And so, what really kind of, there's an article I'm going to talk about here in a second, but really watching Kipchoge's sub 2 hour marathon kind of put this back to the forefront. And it's interesting because you can feel however you want about the sub 2 hour thing, and so many people are all upset about it. And, I don't know. I guess I'm fairly indifferent on it because it wasn't set up as a race and it was never intended to be a race. It was just a flat out, just line it up, see how fast you can go. And, the shoes are the shoes and the pacers are the pacers, whatever it is. But it was just to me, it was just a grand experiment to see how fast you could get a human being to run. And, unfortunately, so we saw that. And then like the next day you saw Bridget Kosgei break, the women's marathon record and run 2:14. And then the shoe thing came back up and, whatever. And then I forgot about the Alberto Salazar ban because it just seems like you just kind of counted him as being dirty. But that's just from knowing a lot over the last, just some pretty obvious things. But whatever. So you have all of that, and you basically have Nike who, on the one side you would just say they push the envelope, and on the other side you would say they blatantly break laws and morals and all that good stuff. So whatever the case is, how you feel about that, I'm not going to talk about that per se, but I will say that their, I guess, desire to push those things and have the whole sub 2 hour project and thing brought on a lot of research. And so, you see a lot of things that it was really because you have a guy who's already is the best in the world, right? He's the best in the world at an event. How do you get him to be just a few seconds per mile faster than what he is now? And to me, that was really kind of what brought, so they did the research to check every little detail to eke out all the little bit of performance. So it has brought, you can take the shoes out of it, you can take the drugs out of it, whatever, but you have their research that will show some revelations and expansions on what really happens in fatigue. And so in July of this year, 2019, there's an Outside Magazine has an article titled "The Real Reason Marathoners Hit the Wall." And it's by Alex Hutchinson. So I would recommend his book Endure if you haven't read it already. It's a great book, and it's pretty interesting because he was kind of brought in to kind of consult some things. And I think he kind of thought the whole Vaporfly thing was kind of some hocus pocus stuff, and then you were seeing what these guys were doing with this shoe, and it was pretty, he was basically turning the corner on it. But then watching the first sub 2 hour attempt in Italy, I think definitely changed. It was exciting for him, and he kind of definitely changed his thoughts on it. But it's a very, the whole book is very good. But the article he writes about was about the sub 2 hour attempt and what researchers were looking at to kind of get those details we were talking about. And it was talking about an idea of critical pace. And so I think cyclists know more about this as, critical power, a lot of times it's called, but critical velocity, whatever the case is. But essentially, it's an idea that's simple at its simplest form. It's basically separating the point between really hard work and just hard work, right? And so there's some articles that are cited in this. In 1991, an article from Joyner for the, I think it was the Mayo Clinic. This guy Joyner writes that, and this is quote, running economy then appears to interact with VO2 max and blood lactate threshold to determine the actual speed at lactate threshold, which is generally a speed to or slightly slower than that sustained by individual runners in the marathon. And that's kind of what they were describing as critical pace. Interestingly, using that model, he'd actually proposed that a human could run 157.58 by a runner with a VO2 max of 84 mLs per kg per minute and a lactate threshold of 85% of that 84. And both of those numbers are very similar to what Kipchoge has. So, and this was back in 91, so this was almost 20 years ago. So very interesting there. But so this you're basically looking at, if you know your pace at lactate threshold. I was kind of confused. I don't know if they were saying that was actually critical pace or if that was just what they were using to predict what you could run for the marathon. And keep in mind, that is that's going to be more accurate the faster you are. So that was really looking more at elite level runners. But essentially, you can kind of get an idea based on that. But the idea of critical pace is, when you look at, you talk about thresholds all the time, but we have the lactate threshold, which is kind of, some people say it's 4 millimoles of blood lactate. Some say it's just that point of deflection. Some call it the MLSS, which is the point of maximal lactate steady state, which is the point where if you don't go beyond that point, your blood lactate won't go up exponentially. You cross that point, your blood lactate goes up exponentially. So there's a lot of different things on there. So I kind of was looking around, and you have the 3-minute test. You have a series of 3 different tests that you can do with a certain amount of rest in between. But then I was looking through what was more kind of practical. And so I kind of came across some of the Coach Tim Man Schwartz, who's out in Colorado. He trains a lot by critical pace, it looks like. And I don't know a ton about his stuff, but if you follow his group, Tin Man Elite, they've got some really great performances, especially on the track and shorter road races. And he uses this as really kind of a staple for training. And he says, you can extrapolate that out to the marathon and things like that. But he defines it as basically the pace you can hold for 30 minutes. And so if you go by that, a lot of you are going to be, for most people, that's going to be between 5K and 10K pace is that critical pace velocity. So if you know that, you can really kind of determine really kind of your ability at anything. But it all stems around basically lactate threshold, but more importantly, how fast you're running at lactate threshold. So, which is interesting because we talk about VO2 max all the time. And I know Steve Magnus hits on, the fallacy of VO2 max, but I think that's pretty well known at this point, was that actually having I've heard it described as having a high VO2 max is basically just a ticket to the dance. If you train hard, your VO2 max is going to be higher than your peers, right? Higher than most of your colleagues. And when you look at people that are of similar ability, most of the time their VO2 maxes are pretty similar. It's other factors that separate them in performance, and it's running economy, things like that. But it's all kind of related to this critical pace. But I think that's really what we're really focusing on, is if that running economy, that lactate threshold, that pace at running economy, or at lactate threshold and all those things, those are really the factors that are going to be determinant in how fast we can run a marathon. So beyond that, they also looked at this idea of anaerobic capacity. And how Mr. Hutchinson describes that, as I thought this was great, is it's basically, you picture it as a full tank, like a full tank of gas, basically. And the more you work above your critical pace, the faster that tank depletes. So that tank is basically from critical pace to VO2 max and above VO2 max. And that's your anaerobic capacity. So regardless of, and this is what's interesting about when you look at other things, but you know, when we look at energy systems, it's not all just one energy system. It's two energy systems working simultaneously. And so you're depleting carbs and you're depleting fat at the same time. You're not burning 100% fat and saving those carbohydrates. You're burning both at the same time. It's just depending on what rate each is being burnt on. And so above your CP, you're going to be burning more and more carbohydrates. So the faster you do that, the more you deplete that anaerobic capacity tank. And so when he was saying is basically as a race goes on, you have less and less of that anaerobic capacity to draw on. So that leaves you at less and less of ability to pick up the pace, cover moves, things like that. So like a lot of times when you go late into a race, you physically can't pick it up. And that's a part of the reason why. So looking at the actual research that they did, a runner's critical pace was tested using that 3-minute sprint that I was talking a little bit about when they were fresh. So after 0 minutes of running, I just did a 3-minute test. And then after 20 minutes of running, 40, 80, and 120 minutes below their critical pace, it was more like a moderate type of running. And what they found was that at 120 minutes of subcritical pace running, even though they were below that, critical pace actually started to decline and did so by about 9%. So as for anaerobic capacity, that declined steadily from 40 minutes of running by 10%, and then it went down to 23%, and then at 2 hours. So basically after 40 minutes of running below your critical pace, your anaerobic capacity starts to decline. So you don't even have to be above your critical pace to start seeing a decline in anaerobic capacity, even from a short period of time. And then you look at critical pace, that's actually going to be declining after you get to 2 hours of below critical pace running. So basically what's interesting is that you can run below critical pace and still see reductions in both of these numbers. And what they found interesting was that elite runners, can run within 4% of their critical pace for the marathon. So that's obviously going to be less for lesser trained people. And what that means is that even at a pace that feels comfortable at the start of the race, it may very well reach a sudden point where it's no longer comfortable. And I think many of you fully understand that part. All right, so how does nutrition play a part in this? So by taking 60 grams of carbohydrate, and they used the Martine gels, or the Martine drink at the time, the reduction of critical pace was minimized. Critical pace was not affected, carbohydrate did not affect anaerobic capacity. So as this depletes, you may slow down very minimally, or you may be forced to be stopped in your tracks, depending on how close you straddle that line of critical pace, right? So the closer you are to that, the more abrupt that slowdown is going to be. So what this means for you is that elite athletes can run within 4% of their critical pace. So I think what I'm guessing, and this is just kind of deciphering from reading these things, is that you have your critical pace, and then 4% less than that is probably going to be pretty close to lactate threshold for those elite runners, because critical pace is going to be slightly above lactate threshold if it's between 5K and 10K pace, and then it might even be like 12K pace for 12 or 15K pace for elite runners. But anyway, and regardless, it's going to be about lactate threshold for most of us. So if you have a lower lactate threshold, it explains a lot as far as differences between recreational runners and all the way up to elite runners. So it's safe to say that recreational runners are going to be much less than that 4% number. And like I said, I haven't seen anything concrete, but I find it even what I'm saying is that the lower level you are, obviously the lower that number is going to be off of critical pace. So you might have a person who's trying to run a 5-hour marathon, they're probably going to be that number that they can run a marathon at is probably going to be like their aerobic threshold. And aerobic threshold is simply where you start seeing kind of a crossover between fat and carbohydrate being used. And you start seeing a slight increase in lactate production. And then you get to lactate threshold, and it's obviously a much more abrupt use of carbohydrate and lactate production. So that's where, and then as you can move up the line. So recreational runner is going to be above aerobic threshold. A sub-elite runner is going to be, or a competitive runner is going to be above that, and then all the way up to elite, where it's just basically going to be at lactate threshold. So I know there's not anything specific, and that's kind of what makes it the problem of pacing right? Because we don't know, like we said, it could feel pretty darn easy, but we're still bleeding that tank of anaerobic capacity. And you couple that, even if we are below critical pace, our critical pace is still going to reduce over time, no matter what. It's just a matter of basically time, and most of us are going to be out there for more than 2 hours. So we're going to start seeing that reduction in critical pace, regardless of whether or not we're running below that pace. And then you couple, so it's a kind of, you got thresholds coming down, you got tanks being depleted all at the same time. And the problem is that early on, it's a very comfortable pace, but it eventually is going to catch up to us. All right, so trying to make sure I didn't miss anything here. So the bottom line, any amount you go beyond what you are capable of early will be the amount plus some when you reach that back third of the race. So like if you're, maybe that's 5 or 10 seconds too fast per mile, that means you're probably going to lose significantly more than that in the back third of the race. So like maybe that last 6 to 8 miles of the race, if you're pretty close to where you should be, it might only be a few seconds per mile. And then obviously the more extreme that crossover is, the more extreme the abruption of reduction in pace is going to be. So I know that's very, very confusing, but basically what you need to know is that just running a comfortable pace is still probably going to put you in a little bit of a hole. So in terms of nutrition, we know that anaerobic capacity is dependent on the glycogen stores already in the muscles. And that even though it appears that ingested carbohydrate during an event doesn't alter the capacity. So however, we saw that carbohydrate intake during the marathon will reduce the decline of critical pace significantly. So the role of carbohydrate ingestion during the marathon is even more important for that than it is just making sure you have enough fuel in the tank, right? But it's the fuel you're taking in leading up to the marathon, making sure those glycogen stores are fully loaded, that is going to help your anaerobic capacity. So how do we improve that? Well, I just said a couple ways we could do that. Making sure we're getting the carbohydrate in during the race, and making sure glycogen stores are fully stocked up prior to the race. But other than that, we can go into improving running economy. This can be in a number of ways. It can be done through losing fat weight, preserving muscle mass but losing fat weight, improve strength and mobility, better fuel utilization, improving form in our strides. And then the second thing is training at critical pace, and this is like Coach Schwartz described. CP will affect primarily our intermediate muscle fibers. If you train with a lot of speed, then you'll make them look more like fast twitch fibers. If you train with a more like a 10K half marathon, you'll get them to look a lot more like slow twitch marathon fibers, and that's really the way we want to go. So if you think about using Hansen's marathon method and you think about those early blocks of speed, think about those as using those for your critical pace training, right? So that's why I always say 10K pace, right? I'm not necessarily telling you to do 5K pace. 5K pace might be too fast for you. If we slow those down to look more like a pace we can hold for 30 minutes, so maybe between 8 and 10K pace for a lot of you, you're going to be a lot better off, because what I talk about all the time is speed is relative to the distance you're racing. So in the marathon, we don't necessarily need all the 5K stuff, but 10K stuff, that's going to train those intermediate fibers, and then you're going to have those to use as looking more like slow twitch fibers, which is going to help you significantly in the marathon. Don't neglect your carbohydrates. We talked about that. Taking 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour of the event. Implement strategies to preserve glycogen stores during the event, which is, lots of, foundational mileage, easy mileage, build up those, the ability for fat to be utilized. This can also be through diet, where you're not completely eating just all processed sugars and things like that. The carbohydrates you're getting for the most part are going to be more complex carbohydrates. Your stomach, you can train your stomach over time. So that mix of high quality carbohydrates and then in the right proportions of fat and protein, you'll be in a much better situation. And then be careful with your pacing. Even if you feel comfortable and you think today's the day, wait for the second half of the race to be aggressive, because remember, even early on, if it feels comfortable, you're still depleting that anaerobic capacity and you're still going to affect that critical pace. So this is why you got to be really, really careful early on. And I saw this a lot at Chicago, and I'm not sure what happened, but I saw a lot of people who were just significantly too fast. And it's one of those things where I think they thought if it was 15, 20 seconds, that was still in the, kind of the standard deviation of being okay. And it really came back to bite them in the end. I saw a lot of people do that, whereas other people were actually a little bit slower those first few miles and actually kind of ramped it up during the whole race. But it makes it even more important to just not get caught up in a situation and crowd situations and just take it out too fast, because even being 10, 15 seconds faster than what you want to be, you do that for 2 or 3 miles, it's going to be significant. So if you find yourself fast, fix it right away. And if anything, be a little slow and build into it. You'll be okay. If you're 15 seconds slow at the mile, don't worry. You have 25 miles to make up 15 seconds. That's less than a second a mile you have to make up, right? So you don't have to make it all up at once. But on the other hand, if you're way too fast, you do have to slow it down right away, because you're going to cause that damage way too soon, and you're gonna set yourself up to be, in that boat where you're gonna lose more time than what you had in the bank. But all in all, this is an extremely limited look into the smallest of marathon fades, but it can explain a lot of what happens to runners. And I've definitely been in this boat too, where I've been running, I think even my best marathons, I was basically on pace through 22 to 23 miles. And then it just it's not a hit in the wall, but it's definitely that there's a sudden drop in pace by 10 to 15 seconds. And so you'll go from being on pace for a negative split at 23 to being slightly off of even pace by the end of the race. So you can still even losing 15 seconds a mile, when you're trying to balance that fine line, it can make or break things, right? So we have to be careful. But the biggest thing is, it just stresses the fact you can't go out too hard. You have to understand and know and realize what your marathon pace is and how that feels, and not get caught up in even being a little bit too fast, especially earlier on. If you're going to get fast, get faster after halfway. Don't be too aggressive early on. It's just going to bleed that tank as it was described, and it's going to affect that critical pace. So, but it's interesting because it's not necessarily an issue of fuel, which we would always say, well, they ran out of carbohydrates. Well, it might not be that, because you look at yourself early on versus later, and you can see those changes in forms, because maybe you weren't doing the core training and you didn't really work on hip mobility and things like that, and your stride changes, which is going to affect your economy, which is going to throw that critical pace off, and all those things get affected based on it's all these things coming at different sides. But it's kind of like what Hutchinson was saying, is that just adds to the mystique of the marathon, and all these little variables that we have to kind of figure out and account for that make it exciting, but also frustrate us at the same time. So, but I just wanted to look at that, and I thought that was interesting article, and it kind of really tied in really well to what the question was actually being asked. So again, don't get caught up in just VO2 max. Get caught up in overall strength and how that's going to improve your running economy, your ability to hold form late into a race, ability to have that critical pace not be decreased as much through the proper type of speed training. And then also, I think it goes into effect, when you get into that rut of going marathon, and you don't really do a full speed segment where you hit on some of these things, that's where it can come up and bite you too. So you kind of lose a little bit of that ability the more you train just for one event. And so it makes sense to come back and hit different events where you're working these different things, and that overall makes you a better marathon runner. So I think that was interesting. Hope that helps you out. If not, at least something to kind of think about. And thanks for listening. We'll talk to you later. All right. See you later, guys.